All right. There we are. We're officially recording again.
Okay, start where,
The third time's the charm, right?
start wherever you want to start.
Okay. Well, what I was saying originally was what brought us back together again is that you wrote another book. So you've written a lot of books, a lot of them that I've read, and the most
I never
recent one,
intended to write any of them actually. They were sort of letters to myself to see if I could figure out a problem.
right?
And then I realized if it worked, then I started publishing it. But it was never an intent to just write all these books or anything like that. It was just it was more documentation of what was going on.
Right. You told me that you originally you were trying to figure it out for yourself,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know?
Well, originally, what happened is um, some of these books you just can't get anymore. So, or at least are not easily available. So I started, logging in and making notes to myself and copying stuff. And it just ended up being books. They were basically, I realized if nobody was documenting this stuff, somebody should. And so that's what I
Yeah.
did.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. I mean, I think that that's really where when you look at, creativity or, people that are artists or whatever, that's what should happen. It should be something I think almost that you can't control.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, it was me figuring it out, but then he figured out and he figured, well, maybe there's an obligation to,
Yeah.
you know, behind all this too. So that was kind of the reason.
No, you had said that before when we had talked too, because I could tell that like when I first heard you on Jan's show, I just felt so drawn to what you were talking about. It just, to me, it just felt so original, you know? And a lot of it, I think some of it was an aspect of it was my ignorance, because even though I grew up a Christian, I had no exposure to like theology, like
Well, I think what's
apologetics,
really,
anything like
though,
that.
I think what's really behind it, and Jan was that was sort of a shared interest, is that they really forgot how to teach people,
Yeah.
and they forgot to, and that's really where this other book I just wrote starts off, is that there's, it's not just a history book of what happened, but it really begins with Plato and Socrates. That one of the big dilemmas at that time is Plato was worried that if people we'd adopt an education system, or if people just read a lot of books and never conceptually understood them, that there would be the end of knowledge.
Yeah.
And that really underneath is what's taken over culture and the teaching
Yes.
methods, and it's really Hermeticism. That's really sort of the core of Hermeticism. It's a different understanding of language and what's the
Yeah.
purpose of language and what's the purpose of education.
Well, that's one thing I realized in one of the books, because on Jan's show you talk about two particular books, and I really liked one of them, which was Authenticating Christianity. But the book that really changed my life and that made me realize that number one, like we kind of talked about before we started recording, that I've been a Christian, I grew up being exposed to the church and being exposed to the Bible and Christianity. So I thought in an aspect, but I'd kind of always been a Christian and I
Mhm.
just had to accept it. I just had to stop kind of running from it. Was the Christian metaphysics book that you wrote.
Mhm.
And, you had talked about that in there. You talked about how there was kind of this juxtaposition between Hermeticism, Gnosticism, where it was just like language was just kind of this dead thing that lacked any meaning.
Right.
And then with Christianity, with the Logos philosophy, there was already embedded in that was that language had meaning, you know?
That's sort of where my little career started, was with that book, and that was kind of all the notes I had taken from all the different stuff I had researched at that time. And I published it for other people that I knew. And what happened is all of a sudden they started publishing ebooks, EPUBs, and Apple contacted me and said they wanted to be one of the first texts that they converted into an EPUB.
Okay.
So I said, sure. And that's really where all of a sudden I started regarding that as more of maybe than just, a catalog of notes and things, that there started to be a little bit of a wider interest in that kind of thing.
Right. So with your last book, I think one of the biggest things that reached out to me, I mean, you go into so much different history. Like that's what I love, I guess I should say from the start. Like anybody that loves history, you know, because like I said, I had no theological backing, but I felt so drawn to what you were saying, just like watching the podcast, reading your books, was that you talk about like French history, you talk about, ancient history. In this most recent book, you even kind of talk about what happened with like, Egyptian history and how that meshed into like the French expedition. So anybody that even loves history, I think would really enjoy reading your books, history and philosophy. Because, like I said, with the Christian metaphysics, metaphysics is another thing.
The dilemma for me
Talk about me.
was most people, oddly enough, particularly academics within Christianity, are not really interested in philosophy anymore.
Yeah.
They, they've adopted a kind of a purely ultra Protestant, even the ones that are liberal, where they really don't want to mess with philosophy that much anymore. And then the main question I ask myself is, it's clear when you talk to average people that have never read philosophy that they're deeply philosophical. They just don't know it.
Yes. Yep.
And it's actually, they are actually a part of the philosophy that Christianity had early on rejected.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided, how do you teach philosophy without teaching philosophy? And so I decided I would do it in this last book, particularly with history.
Yes.
And that way you can tell a story that's perhaps more engaging, but you aren't beating somebody over the head with, philosophical principles and stuff
Yeah.
because you can see it in action.
Right. No, I think that's what's great about your books is that it's like it's intellectual, but it's in a tangible way.
That's my goal. Yeah.
Yeah, no, but it really is though.
What a lot of it's for me started, it wasn't just that the church itself had abandoned its own theology and philosophy. Part of it was at the time, and it's still to this day is a problem, is that people look at the opening chapters of Genesis, and you have a liberal branch that sees it as mythology, and then you have a conservative branch that sees it as its actual, word for word history.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at it and not trying to discredit an element of either one, I began to believe that neither one was exactly right,
Yeah.
that there was problems with both things, and so at some point you start realizing that perhaps both sides have an element of the truth. And so what you try to do is you'd say, well, what do we know is really true? And you try to see if there's really any contradictions there at all.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps you can take the contradictions and come up with another scheme. So and it's kind of subtle, but I've kind of put it in all my books, is that I'm convinced most theology has missed the real purpose of Genesis. And I believe the purpose of Genesis is, if number one, people don't realize is that there's probably two, maybe three different versions of creation in the Bible. There's the one that's at the beginning of Genesis, there's one that's about halfway through, and then there's other references and so even if you're going to say the Bible doesn't contradict itself, you've got to somehow look at all these things and come with a story where all the different truths hold up.
Okay.
And so what I came to the conclusion was, it's pretty apparent that if you, especially in Jewish tradition, if you look at the name of Adam, a lot of people will say it meant ruddy skin or something like that, where they're getting to the ethnic thing. But the older tradition was that Adam actually means the man who speaks.
Yeah.
So now you start looking at the second version of creation, and that seems to indicate that man is a creature that where his ability to think is kind of installed
Mm-hmm.
at a later point, or at some point where he's first primarily an animal, and now he's given like a superpower in a
Yeah.
sense. So haven't tried to explain this to you, but a simple explanation would be imagine you were a dog and you do all the doggy things. You drink out of the toilet and you know, you sniff other dogs and you sometimes eat crap and things like that. And imagine all of a sudden, you were given this superpower where you look down and you actually could reflect on what you were actually really doing.
Yeah.
And you found it reprehensible because now all of a sudden you realize you're not a dog, or you're still a dog, but you're kind of realize what sin is.
Hmm.
And so it, I, I think a lot of these people miss the point in that, not trying to disparage other people's version of this stuff, but that seems to me that's what powered this book, was that several places I had read recently on, theology before Vatican II was that um, the real problem with modern theology is and even in education, is that they really deny the fact of knowledge.
Yeah.
That a lot of these people, a lot of these teaching things really don't know how to teach anymore. They really don't know how to educate and get people intrigued. And so it really was a look at what really happened. Why would something that was so cherished at one time be abandoned?
Right. Well, and I think understanding the way that I came to understand, and it took several years with me being interested in the trivium
Mhm.
and logic and all that stuff, and me just wondering to myself, like, well, why isn't logic taught in schools? I was asking myself that question when I came to know what the trivium
It
was.
was that, I mean, that you'd have to be old enough to experience this, but
Right, but I didn't.
no, you wouldn't. That's my problem, is that I did.
Yeah.
Because there was a definite point in time where they started where I still remember the original method of teaching. And
Yeah.
I was pretty smart at the time. So I actually, Wisconsin was, people don't know this, but Wisconsin was kind of the test bed of a lot of education systems. Education was always pretty big in Wisconsin. And at the time, I was kind of a test bed. So I would get all these new ways of education. They would try them out on me.
Mm.
And so I could see just as a little kid that I was a guinea pig.
Oh, okay.
So I started realizing very early on that, because I actually could solve all the problems, but they were totally different than what the old education was. The old education literally taught differently. It taught ethics. Uh, it really did teach the trivium, because you watch Leave It to Beaver. He goes to grammar school.
Hmm.
Well, grammar was the first stage in the trivium.
Right, right,
And so you went to high school, and so you kind of unknowingly, in some degree, progressed through the trivium. You just didn't know it.
right.
But
But
by
I
the
think it's
time,
for people like bringing that to, why is it important? And what I realized is it's like that is a classical Christian education. And so you have so many people in
there are
act.
some places going back to that.
You said what?
There are some places going back to that.
Yeah, I actually have. There's a school that's down the street that actually I thought about sending my child to, that my son to, that does teach like classical Christian, you know.
Yeah,
So, I mean, there is that, but it's like, I think that for me, just realizing that when you look at academia now, so many of them are atheistic or agnostic. And it's like the foundation of education in, at least the West is it's Christian.
right. But what they've done is, see, that's what this book approaches, is that they didn't do it by teaching people new philosophies so much as they did it by rewriting history.
Yeah. So that's why you
And
have to bring in a historical, going.
yeah, and so what they did is they kind of patched over. I mean, you can
Yeah.
start, simple things like the flat Earth and things like that, but really, they haven't told the right story of Socrates. They haven't told the right story of Aristotle or Plato. And once you get into that, and the guy that I turned to in the book was Athanasius Kircher, who was a Jesuit. He followed on the shirt tails of Saint Robert Bellarmine, who was Galileo's trial judge, as being the head of that part of the Vatican. But what he did is he sent emissaries he had the power to send emissaries all over the world. And I explained this once before, I think, to you, that we get we get told that our modern culture is too Western and too white and all that kind of stuff. But in reality, if you actually go back and check the history, that's not where it came from.
Hmm.
That what we consider Western thought didn't really come from the
Right.
West.
We talked about that and when we had talked before, and I
Yeah.
realized that. Yeah. Yeah.
What we consider Western theology, I mean, the Dark Ages really weren't the Dark Ages, but I would say that what they were from this research I've been able to find is the Dark Ages was just more of a pedestrian kind of farming type community. So it was
Agrarian.
very civilized, but they were kind of books became rare because of Islam uh, blocking them from dissemination. They had the papyrus and the paper. But what really happened is as Islam grew in strength, at the middle of later Middle Ages, refugees from the East brought what we considered Western thought to the West.
Hmm.
And that's the problem because not only was it a big boon to education, but they also brought the wrong Bible with them or a Bible that was missing verses.
Yes, that's where it
And
comes in. Yeah.
and that's where I think the problem started because the very verses on the Trinity, which to my estimation locked in the concept of education and
Yes.
what the fact of knowledge was now missing from all the Bibles.
Yes, man.
And that
Preach
didn't
it.
become official till the 20th century.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the thing. It's just, I don't know. I just love how what you just said right there, it's almost like it's so important. Like you
Yeah.
said, like
It's conceptually not hard.
I know it's just so important, but it's like, man, just,
The early Christ around the Council of Nicaea, which is critically important to all this,
yeah.
Christianity began to be divided up, which meant that the primary education systems in the church was really, really centered around a city in the east, in the Near East called Nisibis. And Nisibis was the center of Aristotle and philosophy. But as Islam kind of plunged the Europe into the Dark Ages, a lot of this education moved east, even as far as to China and Japan. Most people don't know that, people who become Buddhist, for instance, Buddhism was really resurrected by the Jesuits. And
Really.
they really don't know how much of it is authentically Buddhist and how much they overrode it with Christianity. There's a lot of verses. It seems to me that that time they were even trying to synthesize it a bit.
Well,
But there's,
you had said before, I thought that weren't the people, the scribes, weren't they Christian?
yeah,
Or was that the opposite way? Yeah, they were the
the
ones that
scribes that went in because they were all they went in to reconstruct Buddhism, but basically with the idea, I think of it was clear that you follow the Silk Road and you can do it all the way to Japan. There's ancient Christian traditions in kind of isolated Japanese communities that are still practicing communion type things every day. They just don't know
Yeah,
where they came from.
right. They have the tradition, but they lack the doctrine, right?
Right, right. And so what happened is that uh, all the things that you have two factors. One is that the education starts coming back to the Europe by refugees from China and basically they're fleeing Islam. Uh, and all the ideas of light, the physics
Optics.
that kind of. But the other thing is that in Athanasius sending emissaries throughout the world, is that, and this is plays into Plato and Socrates, is that the world largely by the 15th, 16th century was largely, mostly barbaric.
Yeah.
A lot of these cultures they were into animal and human sacrifice.
Sacrifice. Yeah.
I just watched a video yesterday of this North Korean woman that has fled North Korea and is going around to college campuses and saying, well, and this one student got up and asked her, well, what happens to the women in North Korea that don't make it to America? She says, well, usually they make it to China and they get cut up for body parts
Yeah.
or,
Organ
or get
harvesting.
harvesting or sold into slavery or,
Yeah.
trades.
Trafficking. Yeah.
So, I mean, the idea that we've escaped barbarisms And that's really what gets Socrates and Plato going, is that Greek culture had escaped, had become civilized to the point where they weren't doing that type of barbarisms, but they were having, you go to a college and they have a symposium, but the history of the symposium was people getting intoxicated
Yeah.
and having these huge rants, and then they would go through the streets and destroy stuff.
Right.
And the general people, which is even now a derogatory term, the hoi polloi, objected to it because they were wrecking their communities.
Yeah.
So that they had to somehow come up. Plato, who was, all evidence shows, was a very, even though I disagree with a lot of his philosophy and theology, was actually a very humble, ethical person. So he kind of abducted the idea of logos and turned it into a way of linguistically enchanting or capturing the minds of people and to move them away from a barbaric, and that was the beginning of philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
where you start using thought and rhetoric and things to engage people rather than becoming intoxicated or doing barbaric practices.
Right.
And you can't. And eventually, I believe that becomes Christian morality,
That's
and
what I was gonna say. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so by the time you get to the 20th century, that's exactly what they're trying to get rid of, because they're
Yeah.
calling it too white or too Western or things like that, and it's not at all.
Or
It's
oppressive. You know?
Yeah. Well, it's got a heritage that literally does go all over the place.
Yeah.
It's not uniquely European by any means.
Yeah.
Sometimes people forget. One of the things in the book that I didn't make a huge deal out of it, but when the Council of Nicaea happened and this whole controversy of the Trinity happened, Athanasius is kind of given the markings of a hero because he supposedly solved the problem. Where if you actually read dig and dig and dig for the books, he was kicked out. He ran for his life uh, to all parts of the world because just to escape being killed. But he was actually a bishop in of Egypt, and so one of the stronger areas. I doubt that it was as black at the time, but it was probably a mixture, of different peoples.
Hmm.
The stronger church that kept actually the tradition was the African church.
Ethiopian, right?
Ethiopian, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So
Ethiopian
I mean,
Orthodox.
if you don't get these simple things right, you can read into them a whole bunch of crap. Really,
Right.
it's
Well, we went into a lot there. Well,
right.
I'm trying to think because like I usually have in my mind, like I sent you a template of what I,
Go
kind of
ahead, fire.
no, but I'm thinking maybe I should just ask the second one first. This is just like went into the Trinity and we talked about, how that relates to education and Christianity and all that stuff. So, kind of one of the main things you're doing in your book is you're cataloging, or I guess you're going through the chronology of history for how removing one verse from the Bible, like how that happened. Because I know
Right,
you said in your book that it's been like, it's well documented, but it's been like over 100 years since it's really been talked about publicly.
right.
So,
As I told you before, I went to the seminary I used to work at, and they didn't even know it.
yeah,
They,
not
they,
well known,
yeah,
But I guess on the surface, like if you read the verse, most people would kind of be like, okay. Because I
yeah,
mean, you have been sharing your research with me as you've, gone on. And I've been very interested in the Trinity, understanding how it relates. That's really what brought me back to wanting to be a Christian again, was just understanding the significance of the Trinity. Because I
well,
mean, you have
I was,
churches now that are Unitarian, they don't even think they think
and
they can
that's the
be a
problem.
Christian without being a Trinitarian. And it's just like
That's the
that's
problem, is
not
that
Christianity.
they're all versions of an Islamic kind of an Islamic religion that Napoleon invented.
Okay.
And, and so what happens is I would argue there's actually two verses. One has been taken out, and that's 1 John 5:7, which talks about the Trinity. But the other corrupted verse, and it's still in the Bible, but it's I believe it's in Timothy, but it says don't adhere to doctrines, or it's they actually word they use gnosis, which in
Okay.
some versions translate as science. Some define it as Gnosticism, and it says gnosis falsely so called.
Okay.
Okay. So, and that actually becomes a pivotal verse in the different denominations because it not having a good solid definition of it, you can accuse the other things of not being strictly orthodox or whatever. It becomes a plaything. But one of the things that struck me is finding the original story of Cerinthus in
Mm.
his writing of the false
Yeah.
gospel.
Yeah.
And Saint Irenaeus literally tells you what that verse means and how it's a slander on Logos. And
Hmm.
that was basically Cerinthus' design to
Yeah.
corrupt Christianity and introduce a false version of John.
Right.
And it's that false gospel. If now if you understand the Trinity, it backs up the other concepts of the Trinity, which aren't very well defined in the Bible, and now makes them well defined. But it also gives you a key, the clue, as rather than being able to go around call this Gnosticism or that Gnosticism, or just being a word of derision against people you don't agree with. Now you got a firm definition of what that means. And so Gnosticism really is the theology of Cerinthus.
Okay. Yeah.
And now you get back to the 20th century and you realize that is the that is the corrupted gospel. That is what all these people from Isaac Newton to the Freemasons, and they're all uh, that they officialized in 1895, even though they didn't make it public. But I believe, being it was in Berlin, that became the dogma of the Nazis. And
Mm.
eventually, after World War II, they started making it public. And I think that's why the Dead Sea Scrolls are important, because that they use the Dead Sea Scrolls to officialize the Nag Hammadi scrolls,
Mm.
or texts, codices. And by doing that, they were able to introduce this Gnostic theology into Christianity, and that ends up, I think, by the 1960s, gets officialized by the liberal branches of the church, which forces the conservative branch of the church, not having any understanding what was going on, into being ultra conservative then too.
Yeah.
Because what are they going to do? They
Right.
got where are they going to flee to?
Right. And that's the thing. Like, I think that one thing you do so many things in your book, but going also through like how Gnosticism, Arianism, Marxism, we have all these isms. And I
Yeah.
think that now there's a lot of people that I would classify themselves more as like conservative that can kind of, especially with what happened with COVID, you see this like authoritarianism, you see this totalitarianism, you see, you call it communism,
Yeah.
and you see how that's resurfacing. But I know you've said a lot, and I think that you do a great job cataloging in your book how all of these things are related. Like it's important to
Yeah.
understand the history of Gnosticism and Arianism, because even when you first started talking about this, especially like Arianism and Unitarianism, I wasn't quite seeing how it connected to, what I was concerned about, like even before COVID, like I kind of saw that we were in, there
I'm
was,
not sure I understood it myself entirely, to be honest with you. What
yeah,
happened is Athanasius Kircher's history is very thick, and there's only one book really that was ever written in English that describes his thing, that was translated, and he described it. It's by William Enfield,
yeah,
who is actually an arch Unitarian, but he does, I believe, accurately tell the story of early philosophy. And even though he sees Unitarianism as the solution, which it's not,
yeah,
you can go back. Where he makes the mistake is he correctly identifies the heresy. And the
okay,
heresy is that all this leads to one mind thinking,
right,
which in the end of knowledge is their pinnacle of everything, is that they're trying to organize philosophy and theology so that there is no distinction ultimately between your mind and my mind, and that answers a bunch of philosophical problems. But that eventually becomes Unitarianism. And if you put all these stuff together, you realize the ideal of modern society is this Unitarian mind that
Yeah.
we should all think alike somehow.
Hmm.
And while they, on one hand, promote diversity, they're philosophically they're promoting what's called a philosophical monism.
Yeah.
And you think, well, if Christianity is true, what protected the concept of uh, this kind of unity? Well, it was the Trinitarian verse that the highest
Yes.
ideal we could think of was still had distinctions to it,
Yes.
knowable distinctions.
Yeah. That's the foundation of education.
Right,
It's just
right.
you
Well, that's why
can't.
you get the trivium. It's
Yes,
all of a sudden you read. It's a subtle point, but once you realize it, it explains a lot
it
of
really
stuff.
does, man. Yeah.
And so probably the most complex part of my book is Gödel's incompleteness theorem,
Yeah.
and it's not really that complicated. It just says a doctrine can't prove itself.
Yeah.
You need something beyond the moment a doctrine incorporates itself means it's no longer a doctrine because it is no a business ability to say it's true or false. You need that objective thing on the outside. And so as soon as you make a complete philosophical dogma, its very completeness means it's false.
Hmm.
Well, the Unitarian concept, the socialist communist concept, is that we should all be one.
Yeah.
Well, that basically argues itself to pieces. It can't work.
It's
And
not
so
meaningful. There's
it
nothing.
has no meaning. Exactly right. It has no
No
meaning at
meaning to
all.
it.
So
Yeah.
what happens is the pursuit of knowledge becomes thwarted.
Yeah. And that's when you say that knowledge is paradox and all these things that you said in
Yeah,
the book
it
that,
necessarily becomes paradoxical.
yeah.
So I don't think it's a complicated. It's got a lot of detail in it, but
Yes.
if you get that concept, you get the book.
Right. What was saying that one of the questions I was thinking of asking you was, so I think that when you look at the state that we're in right now, where it's like a lot of people, I think, kind of, I hate using terms woke up, but, COVID made people, you know, see kind of the problem that we're talking about. We're talking about more from like a philosophical, theological perspective. But I think that people view this issue too much from a political lens.
Mhm.
But it got me thinking, like me kind of understanding all of this, understanding kind of the basis of education and where Christianity comes into that. Like, do you think that the separation of church and state did that, like, I didn't want to have to look at my question, but it was like, did the separation of, I had it written out, like, do you think the separation of church and state has hurt our ability to maintain our rights in the West?
Yeah, I think you got to go back and look at the history of the separation of church and state. It's not American. It was
Okay.
actually French. And
Okay.
it actually, the part that's been missing is everybody says, well, the Freemasons did it or something like that. And I always rejected that. It's kind of conspiratorial theory or something like that. But the fact of the matter is the Freemasons did do it.
Mm,
That what happened is Napoleon enlisted the structure of the Freemasons as kind of a conduit to move his Gnostic thoughts. And he literally says he wants to create a new religion. But by the time you get to the point where the Gospel of Cerinthus appears in 1895, I think it actually was earlier than that, but that's kind of the accepted thing. That that's kind of what they're arguing is the people behind that were claiming to be Freemasons started pushing this radical idea of separation of church and state. And the reason is because one of the big puzzles for me was the Dreyfus affair, because none of the things seemed to make sense. It was this international affair, but it was just one military officer. But you start looking at all the different people behind it. They're all Freemasons or atheists and archaeologists. So what they were really trying to do is France was in a situation where the King of France would have been reinstated. And so they had to muddy up the church in order
Okay.
to prevent that. So what they were doing is that it kind of set a precedent of the state attacking the church and trying to discredit it. Um, I don't, I'm not so sure the government should dictate anybody's religion, but
Yeah.
it shouldn't be antagonistic, particularly to Christianity. And
Right.
as you said before, is that Christianity is, when you really see it, is arguing a completely different thing than what the other religions are. The other religions are all pretty much arguing for this unity.
Yeah.
Christianity is arguing for a Trinity.
Yes.
And so I think it's not any accident by the time you get out of World War II that there's a kind of a close knit between the trivium and the quadrivium education system and the concept of the trivium in the church. So to me, it's not surprising that one goes, that the state eradicates the trivium from the system. We used to have grammar schools, we used to
Yeah.
teach logic and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That if one's got to go, the other's got to go
Yeah.
because one leads to the other and they can't risk that.
Right. Yeah, because that's the thing. I mean, that's the thing that I think people, that's what we're taught in school is that the separation of church and state, like it freed us from, the oppressive church in England and all this stuff. And it's like, I'm sure that there's some truth to that. But if you don't understand, what Christianity was and why it was so important to education. It's like saying that you can't like have the Bible in schools. And it's funny me saying all this. I guess I should just say like it took me a long time to come to this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like even though I grew up being a Christian, like
Well, they weren't teaching you stuff like that. A lot of this stuff just vanished. They didn't want you to know.
of
The
course.
the Going back to one of your questions you asked me, I'll do your end of it a little bit. Is you asked me what influenced me from my father,
Yeah,
and
that was another one. Yeah, yeah.
and he was a war hero. He was a B-17 pilot in World War II, had actually 36 missions, three were secret, and was highly decorated. Uh, he came back to the United States and was on Roosevelt's honor guard.
Okay.
And from there, he was charged with ferrying the Memphis Belle to different places as part of the building up, the the war, what would you call morale and things like that. But being that well connected, he was an officer, and he would tell me the real stories of what was going on, and it wasn't what was in the history books. And so, and he also noticed that there was a lot of similarities between what the Nazis were teaching and what the New Age was doing at the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was charged with flying the Memphis Belle around the different airports to build up morale, but he said privately, he said, they had three Memphis Belles, and which was the most famous B-17 bomber ever,
Okay.
because it's, you can look up the Memphis Belle. But he said they had actually three Memphis Belles that they had painted up because it was a propaganda thing. And
Okay.
and I said, well, how do you know which one you were flown? He says, because his was the worst one. He said it was all beat up with battle
That was
damage.
the worst one.
So he was pretty convinced he had the real Memphis Belle because it was all falling apart.
That's funny.
But I mean, that's the type of the other thing he told me at the time. He said, the United States actually had the ability before the nuclear bomb to destroy Germany with
Okay.
incendiaries. And
Really?
he insisted that the firebombing of Dresden was a raid that they normally they would fly about halfway over and they'd get called back. And
Okay.
he said somebody didn't get the message. So, you look up the firebombing of Dresden. It's not the story you get. And I don't know that his is 100% correct, but I believe, he wouldn't lie to me. But you start realizing that the narrative that's in the history books on a lot of stuff, it's always suspicious to me when you look up something like the Dead Sea Scrolls or the flatness of the earth or things like that, that a lot of times they tell this disparaging side of the story, but they never give the other side an even break.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Well, and
always
like with
suspicious.
Galileo, the one
Yeah,
Galileo is the one that really woke me up, where you talked about that, and you even sent me part of transcripts
yeah,
from that trial, and it's like seeing how much that has been propagandized is really astonishing. Yeah.
right. So is it I would say the problem is with the relationship of church and state is, and I address this in the book kind of briefly, but all the monarchies of Europe were were Christian monarchies, and they got their authority from the uh, from their being ordained part. In some ways, a king is considered ordained,
Yeah.
and so if Christianity starts proving fatal, or nobody believes it anymore, their all their power is in it threatens their power. So what you now you got to go and say, well, why was Christianity being threatened in the authority of it? Well, it was a lot of it was Isaac Newton.
Yeah.
Isaac Newton was a closet Arian. The
Mhm.
verse that we're talking about, the Trinitarian verse, he wrote one of the main dissertations that got rid of it.
Yeah.
So you realize it was science that's kind of started threatening Christianity, but science had this Arian Unitarian bend to it,
Yeah.
which Newton stuck to, and is later, after World War II, when they started publishing. In fact, in my book, what surprised me was a lot of the stuff that I put in the book was things that have nobody had translated before.
Mm.
The one thing that there's a Bishop Porphyry who was one of the first ones to find the Codex Sinaiticus. He wrote a pamphlet saying why it was an Arian document. You couldn't find it. So I spent weeks trying to find it. When I did find it, it was in Church Slavonic.
Okay.
Well, who knew Google Translate translated Church Slavonic? And so a lot of these things like Isaac Newton's occult text, but my wife's calling me. Um, the occult texts were all written in Latin, which would have been very difficult to translate, but Google Translate just translates it. So a lot of the things in that book are things that were translated for the first time for public consumption.
Yeah. Well, that's the things about why, if anybody, for me to kind of advocate for you, that's why your work is so important. Because I think I said this before we were recording, because we recorded a couple of times, had technical problems. You go after, like, you read a lot. I should say that first of all. You read a lot. You've shared your research with me, and you go after primary source documents. Like you said, you're
Mhm.
having to like translate stuff.
Right.
So the stuff
There's a
that,
lot in that book that was never printed in English ever before.
yeah. So it's like people that would maybe be interested in some of these topics, it's like you bring such a uniqueness to it because you're willing to kind of do all of that legwork, like going into books that are different languages, reading books that are, hundreds to thousands of years old, looking at old manuscripts, all this stuff. It's like you can tell, at least for me, because I don't read as much as you, but I
I
think
don't read as much as I used to either. So
yeah, but I think that, probably more than maybe the average person. I'm not comparing myself to like an academic, but I probably read more
good
than,
for you, because I don't either.
yeah, like I probably read more than maybe the average person. Maybe lately I haven't been, but I think most of my life I've been that way.
Right.
And it's like you can just tell that when you're reading your book that it's like it's unique information.
Yeah.
It's like you don't hear this anywhere else. So,
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the reasons they were able to get rid of the Trinitarian verse is that they had to disparage a saint named Lucian,
yeah.
which he does have a little bit of sketchy background, but he turned it around. He was considered a major saint at the time. But right before I published it, I probably one of the more important things I put in the book that I had just found right before I was ready to click the trigger to have it published was the creed that was based around Lucian's. It was literally Lucian's creed, which influenced the Council of Nicaea and the final Nicene Creed, which is accepted by all these churches, but they've never really researched where it came from. But uh, to English researchers, Westcott and Hort, were really kind of responsible for this new translation and getting from the Greek getting rid of that verse. Uh, they had to disparage him because he wrote a creed, or a creed was written based on his teachings that refers to and all they were looking for is one reference to that the verse existed before uh, anciently.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Lucian puts it in his writings, and that's I had to hunt and hunt and hunt for that. But the thing is, once you find it, he does refer to it, and the very people that at the time thought that the verse was not authentic said, "Well, then it's authentic." But you don't find that anywhere. They kind of back down. By the time you get to the 1960s, I mean, you look at probably one of the top scholars of this false gospel of Cerinthus, which they never tell you is false and has been proclaimed false by early Christians.
Yeah.
That is Karen King from Harvard.
Yeah.
The other one is Bart Ehrman.
Yeah.
And they'll all tell you the default setting of Christianity is Gnosticism. Well,
Yeah.
it's demonstrably not.
Elaine Pagels is another one. I read her The Gnostic Gospels. I
Yeah,
read that in college, you know.
yeah.
That helped
Well,
to
that's
solidify losing my faith, you know. It's
yeah,
like,
right, exactly. And I know that because I've read those things too.
yeah.
So the thing is, that's where the church, I think, is missing it because they don't know that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
And you're just trying to be honest and you're just trying to say, well, maybe look at both sides or something like that. But you can go throughout the church. They won't have an answer for that. They won't tell you that. And so what they do is they acquiesce, leading to you wondering, are these people in league with, these counter forces, whether it's the CIA or whatever? You start looking at the techniques and stuff that they're using. Well, somebody had to teach them these techniques.
Yeah.
Why are they, you never see anybody really much putting up a really good argument as to, in fact, I think my book's the only one that actually does put up a good argument why what they're telling you can't possibly be true.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I was thinking as you were talking with another thing that you say in your book, this is us kind of switching gears, but is that you say that people in the past, you're not trying to, I think, say that they were perfect or had a perfect faith or anything, but you said that you think that at one time people once knew the adversary, like most of all, and how that differs from
Yeah,
all.
you asked me that, and I sort of now regret I didn't explain that a little bit better.
Okay.
Um, and I realized that there's a tradition there that maybe older people know about, and that there was a famous book called The Creator and the Adversary.
Oh, okay.
And the idea of the book was the adversary is just another name for Satan or the
Right.
devil.
Right.
But what the idea of the creator and the adversary was to show you, because science was starting to encroach, and especially with this Unitarian concept that, well, Satan or the adversary is kind of a figment of our imagination. You don't see this book around anymore. I've got a copy of it. But what the creator and the adversary shows is several situations that uh, theory doesn't hold true. There's evils in the world that can't be accounted for by that Unitarian type thing where everything has this intrinsic good to it.
Yeah.
Um, there's a lot of people who believe in evolution, for instance. And one of the examples I remember is that there's a thing called an earworm, which
Mm.
is disastrous to cattle. It crawls in there and they put it in a Star Trek even, I think, at one time only as a alien thing. But the guy, I've seen arguments about the earworm that it has no evolutionary purpose whatsoever.
Okay.
And so the question is, what could have possibly led to the evolution of something that has virtually no evolutionary process at all? And so they make an argument that it can only be evil.
Mm.
And so what happens is I think that goes kind of hand in glove with what's going on is this kind of diminishing of the idea of evil, that there aren't really evil intentioned people out there.
Yeah.
They are, they're all of this ethnicity or something like that. And so I try to use the term adversary as kind of a broad concept that I hoped it was clear that I was referring to a satanic type thing, but
Yeah.
also broadening it out to that you would kind of allow other adversarial things, that they're not always, the adversary is not necessarily good intentioned, that there is adversarial things out there that have no good intention whatsoever.
Right. No, I did. I understood that component that, Satan is referred, like in the book of Job, they refer, it's kind of Satan is referred to as the
Yeah.
adversary. But it's just, I think that for me, you quoting that and just thinking about kind of modern times and especially, what's happened the past couple of years with COVID. I watched yesterday, like, do you watch Tucker Carlson with his
Once
new
in a while. Yeah.
network? And so he had a guest on where she was kind of talking about, it seemed like she was raised Jewish, and it seemed like she'd kind of always been exposed to faith. But it's a really good interview, and she's kind of talking about how her seeing the evils of the world,
Mhm.
how that, enhanced her belief in God, and how she kind of had to turn to God, seeing all of the evil.
Mhm.
And it just really resonated with me because it isn't just like we were saying in the beginning, what piqued my interest in Christianity was kind of like understanding the Trivium and how that relates to the Trinity and academia and all this stuff historically. But it's also, I think, when you experience, I guess it would be evil, where it's like, I don't think I've had, I'm sure that people have had, I know people have had much worse experiences than me, but even kind of seeing it in the world and having a mind where you can see evil. And I look at it like with what happened, with COVID and a lot of that and these mandates being pushed on people and how, it's come out now with like a lot of adverse reactions where it's like collectively, globally, worldwide, there was a lot of evil that was perpetrated.
Right.
And there was a lot of people that couldn't see it. And I was somebody that, I don't want to call myself a prophet or anything, but I think that I had become aware enough that it kind of like didn't surprise me what happened.
Yeah.
I was kind of prepared for it. And I think it was because I had had certain personal experiences happen in my life that had prepared me to
Right.
be able to
You
see.
looked evil straight in the face. But I think part of that is also people who've gotten on the other side. At some point, you almost have to look at some of these evil things that happen as a blessing in some sense, because being exposed to true evil somehow, it somehow makes you grow.
Yeah.
And but it also opens to the fact that I think a lot of, especially the liberals, that you might be the evil yourself.
Mm.
The idea that you have a
You have
zeit.
the potential for that, I think, is the
Yeah,
thing.
yeah,
Yeah. Yes.
that maybe the adversary is correct, and you might be the one, and you have to do, and so it forces you to do some soul searching, which
Yeah.
I think that's a genuinely Christian thing, but so many people reject that, and so they just, the one I watch every once in a while that just kind of blows my mind is Charlie Kirk, when he goes into colleges and stuff, that he ends up arguing with people that you can tell either it's almost like they're possessed in a way, because they conceptually don't understand what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And when they feel like they're backed up against the wall, uh, I think a lot of research we've kind of missed the point in psychology and stuff like that, is if you've ever had real anxiety, you realize that about the only way people, if you go to a doctor or something, they'll give you drugs or medication, but seldom will they try to get you to work your way through the anxiety.
Yeah.
So drugs and stuff has become a fix-all, which now you go back to Plato and Socrates. Well, that's what they called a pharmakon.
Yes.
And the pharmakon was, although we kind of consider it, the word translation, as remedy, it's really poison. And that
Yeah.
it's poison is something that can be beneficial or detrimental.
Right.
And that's true about sin. That's true about all this stuff. It's the people who you can trust are the people who have lived an self-examined life
Yeah.
and realize that, that guy, that was evil, but I'm also potentially, it can be any of us.
Yeah. That's where atonement comes in, like
Yeah, yeah,
realizing that you can be possessed by
right,
the adversary. And even if you're not possessed, like it can affect you. And it's like, humbling yourself to realize that. I think you have to have it's a combination of understanding some of these things conceptually that you're talking about,
right.
combined with
Anytime you
something
discern
that
something,
happens to you, you know?
anytime you discern something, you risk prejudice. And
Yeah.
so you see all these arguments nowadays. This kind of strikes me. I mean, my acquaintances, in fact, my family, your family is multiracial.
Yeah.
Uh, so sometimes you get in a situation where they say, well, that's racist or something like that. Well, my family's multiracial, is yours.
Yeah.
And so, but you see all these people saying, well, the other guy's the racist. Well, maybe the more healthy thing is admitting maybe we're all racist to some degree, and that's something we need to atone for.
Yes.
All of us. And because we sort of self-aggrandize and self kind of give ourselves a pass when that's not in our power. Those are sins. That's the very concept of sin.
Right.
No, and to think that anybody's can proclaim a perfection in any one of these categories is kind of missing the point.
Right. It's a fallacy.
Yeah.
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 Well, I wanted to, since we've been kind of going back and forth, we haven't been, I don't even know how long we've been recording, but I, you had said in an email exchange a while ago, which I kind of didn't, when you first had said it, I didn't completely understand what you were saying, but you had basically said that I think Christianity ended in like the 17th century. And then you
Yeah.
kind of talked about deism and all this stuff. But that what when I thought reflected more on that and what I wanted to ask you is that I guess I look at what we're living in right now is we're in a post-Christian world,
Right.
where a lot of people I think who are Christians and who maybe wouldn't, haven't been exposed to the kind of things that we're talking about here, they would kind of like look like, well, what do you mean? And so it's like, for me, I think I'm asking honestly for myself, where it's like, how do you live a Christian life in a post-Christian world, knowing all of this stuff that's happened?
I In a way, it's sort of like, to me, realizing that Christianity ended as we sort of know it, but that doesn't necessarily mean the tradition ended. And the Bible literally says at one point that it'll be forever. And so I think what happens is that we're kind of in a dilemma with Christianity, in that the authentic church, as I just told you before, had an apostolic succession to it,
Okay.
that had an officially ordained clergy. And part of that ordination was really the reception of the Holy Spirit, which really goes back to Genesis with, that kind of infusion of mind into animal. That would be the analogy that, in a sense, what happens in a church where all the doctrine has vanished.
Yes.
You're aware that there's an official doctrine now because I've kind of exposed it.
Yeah.
Where are we in that kind of climate? And I don't believe we're in a post-Christian era.
You don't think so?
I would rather argue that we've never been in a totally Christian.
We've never even been there.
We've never really totally been there. So, I mean, because you've always had these kind of false Christianities, you've had all this kind of stuff. And you go back, I mean, that was never more clear. One of the things that was in my book that I kind of have the connections still. I go around and test these things between, scholars that I know and see if they've ever heard of them. You look up, when was the temple of Jerusalem really destroyed?
Was it in like this?
Almost everybody will give you the wrong answer.
Okay.
So they'll tell you probably 70 AD, 69 AD,
Okay.
when really it really wasn't destroyed until the latter part of the fourth century. It
Mm,
it was cast down, but it really wasn't destroyed until Julian the Apostate sent people back to rebuild it, and they demoed it themselves.
yeah.
And it was as they were in the process of demoing it and rebuilding the new cathedral or the new temple that an earthquake hit, which literally shattered all the competing temples throughout the Middle East. You can see it to this day, they're still in ruins. That it was that act that really gave Christianity its legs, that went on to go on and adopt the Nicene Creed, and really everybody saw that as there's no place else to go at that point.
Hmm.
So clearly at that point, you've got 300 plus years of Christianity that is still Christian, but is not the fullness of the church yet, because the fullness of the church didn't come until after the Nicene Creed, and that had happened. It was still struggling in a lot of ways. It was complete, but still struggling.
Okay.
So by saying that the Christianity ended about, you know, I believe you should have an ordained clergy. And I believe that the ordained clergy, what defines that ordination is the infusion of these doctrines. But if everybody's denying these doctrines, that presents a dilemma,
Right.
um, which is kind of why I really wrote some of these last books, is hoping that clergy would read it and say, you know, I can't. You got a lot of clergy these days. I don't care which denomination, that just sort of are self-ordained, or just say I've had some magic process handed over me. Somebody maybe laid hands on me or said a thing to me or something, and now I'm godly, you know.
Yeah.
But it's a process. To be godly means you got to work at it. You got to like understand these things, and so what happens in the church when you walk into the church and you understand more of this than the ordained clergy does? What does
Right.
that say?
I know.
And that's where you're at right now.
Yeah.
I know you, I've talked with you. You, even though you may doubt this to some extent, but I guarantee you, you've got a better foundation than 90% of the people that I run into that claim to be bishops and cardinals. And uh, so when I say the church ended, it's really acknowledging that that's the state of things right now.
Yeah. And I guess in the past, I would have said, how can we change that? But I think that for me, that's why I kind of wanted that when I was thinking of what I could kind of ask you to wrap up our conversation. Change starts within ourselves and how
Right.
we conduct our daily lives. And, when you come to understand certain things about the world that are really important, where I feel like that's what you've done for me. Like you've done a lot for me, where when I first reached out to you, I thanked you and I didn't know if we would actually have a conversation like this, but I really just wanted to thank you that, reading your books helped me grapple with something that I've been grappling with a long time. I mean, it helped me with, losing my faith and then going down this path and not realizing how much, or I guess I did eventually realize how much like not having a certain kind of spirituality, and I almost hate using that word, but you
Yeah,
know,
well, I mean, it can be meaning a lot of different
it can
things.
mean a lot of different
It's a
things.
dangerous
But
term in a way. Yeah.
yeah, it's just like realizing what that did to me, you
Yeah.
know. But I think that it's also just knowing how to move forward, and it's not, we can't, there's only so much that we can control, and I think that's the stage I'm at in my life, where when I first talked to you, I was more in that stage of like, okay, I know these things, like what can we do to like really make a massive change, like make a macro change. And I think that a lot of people, when they come across really big issues, they think that way, and it's like, well, I think that you first, you need to study enough to understand what the issues are, and then figure out how you can implement that in your own life,
All
how
right.
you
That
can.
will end it, and I'm going to give you the answer. And it was the answer that was given to me by somebody else. is you understand that it took 300 years for Christianity to mature, and it didn't go anywhere in that era. But it really wasn't fulfilled entirely, or real, maybe fulfill is not the right word, but realized in a sense, until the Council of Nicaea, actually the Council of Constantinople, when all this stuff came together. And now it's reemerged again. So you got the same problem. So in a way, we are back to that same era, that same mindset between the original Pentecost and when the church actually emerges after uh, Nicaea. Uh,
Okay.
so what does that give you to do? Well, I would say we have to adopt kind of the mindset of what it was like before they resolve these things, make people aware. But I went to a meeting a long time ago at an Orthodox church, and a bunch of, me and a few seminarians went to, they had this archbishop, Orthodox archbishop, and somebody asked him that very same question. And he said, I can't be, nobody's going to ordain me. Nobody's, I can't become a monk because I'm married and all this other kind of stuff. He says, what? So he asked the archbishop, he said, what's there left for me to do? And the archbishop turned to him and said, you can become a saint.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's,
At least strive for it. I
yeah,
think that's how you should live your life. I was
right.
listening to, or I used to listen to a Catholic podcast when I first started listening to your work. And he always ends, or at least back then, I haven't listened to him in a long time, but he ends a lot of his shows with "Be a saint."
Yeah.
Like what else is there? Or it's something like,
Well, I mean, that's
yeah,
what we got.
that's it.
Yeah.
You just strive for that, and we're gonna fail,
Mhm.
and that's
And the
when,
saints weren't all perfect either. I mean,
right, right.
there you go. You can become a saint.
That's it. That's a
That's it.
good way to end it. Be a saint. What else is
Yes.
there? That's funny. I haven't thought of that in a long time. Well, where can people buy your book
Uh,
or find it at least? We kind of talked about that when we weren't recording
yeah,
yet.
it should be on Amazon by now.
Okay.
Uh, it
You
should
want
be
to
a
you want
lot
to
of
hold it
places.
up? What is it? You had it right there, didn't you?
Yeah. Um, there you go.
There it is. Yeah. The Three
It's not,
Divine
it
Witnesses.
looks big, but the thing is, I've got it several places that it takes time for it to get out to all the places, especially as an EPUB.
Okay.
But a secret to you guys, and if you want it, you can go to Jan's Logos Media site and download it for free.
So you can either buy it on Amazon,
I've set the price pretty low. So
right? Or you can go to logosmedia.com and you can like read a PDF version.
actually I think it's an EPUB version.
Oh, an EPUB version. Okay. Okay. That's like the kind
It seems to be the way everybody's going these days. And uh
actually still like having like books.
me too. I'd rather have the book.
Yeah.
It, it doesn't cost me anything to make an EPUB and send it around. And I think if people see it and I truly like it, they'll probably want a real copy.
Right.
So it's kind of it's a bit encyclopedia-ish in a way that there's stuff in there you're not going to find other places. So if you're interested, you might want it on hand. And
Yeah. It is, but it's also like, especially when I saw how you revised it, me seeing more of like, I don't know if you would call it a draft, but not the final version, and then seeing the final version, it made me at least like the way that you were able to end your chapters, I wanted to go to the next chapter, you know.
to be honest with you, when I sent you the original draft, I didn't know how it was going to end because I knew I hadn't tied everything up yet.
Yeah.
But sending it around and talking about it with people sort of, like I said, probably the crucial thing that tied it all together was finding the Lucian's Creed.
Okay.
And that some of this stuff just, I'm not telling you, it just appears. I wasn't looking for it. All of a sudden there it was. And
That seems to be a common theme with you.
it's you ask the right question, somehow it has a way of getting to you. Yeah.
Yeah. The answers pop up.
Yeah.
All
I
right. Well, should we end it there? I've taken
sure.
it's already 5 o'clock here, so
Yeah, we can. My wife's trying to get me on my
I
phone.
know I saw that. So here,
So
I'll end the recording here. Oh, wait a minute. Let me stop it here.